and press the bell icon so you never miss an update from Prep Ladder.
And the first important aspect under this policy is the ideologies. Take a look. There emerge several ideologies, and the ideologies and the British policies had close link. The ideologies shaped many British policies. The ideologies influenced many British policies. Though there emerged several, but for the preliminary examination, just 4 ideologies you're supposed to keep in your mind, and these 4 are presented here. So in this presentation you find the 3 phases are there: 1772 to 1813, 1813 to 1858, and 1858 onwards. And you find 4 ideologies are mentioned. First, Orientalist, that played role during the first phase. Second, Evangelicals, and third, Utilitarians. They played role during the second phase. And the third, White Man's Burden, that played role 1858 and onwards. So first ideology, Orientalist. Second, Evangelicals. Third, Utilitarians. Fourth, White Man's Burden. Could be questioned straightway, like who were Orientalists during British period, like who were Utilitarians during British period. And as regards the influences of these ideologies are concerned, the influences of the 3 ideologies, Orientalist, Evangelicals, and Utilitarians, are important for you. So, among these 4, you should know the essence of all, and among these 4, you should know the influences of the first 3. Orientalist focused on Oriental learning, and they focused on knowing India, and they focused on no change on Western lines. That means they focused on maintenance of Indian socio-cultural tradition, and they influenced the British social policies during this period. That is 72, 1813, and during this period we don't find any social change on Western lines. We find certain initiatives, they were meant for knowing India. And these certain initiatives are also important for your exam. Take a look, I have a presentation for you. This presentation is Orientalist moves, and they represent certain very, very important initiatives by the Orientalist, and each is important, a fact important for your exam. First is Foundation of Calcutta Madrasa in 1781 by Warren Hastings. So this fact is important for you. Warren Hastings represented the ideas of the Orientalist. Second is Foundation of Asiatic Society of Bengal in 1784 by William Jones. William Jones was one important member of this group known as Orientalist. And the purpose of Asiatic Society of Bengal was to promote Oriental learning, and that means to promote a study of India. Next, Foundation of Sanskrit College at Banaras by Jonathan Duncan. Now, consider foundation of these 3 Calcutta Madrasa, Asiatic Society of Bengal, and Sanskrit College at Benares. They were all meant for the study of India and to promote Indian studies. Next one is translation of Bhagavad Gita. And after this, all the other points, 4 to 10, they are all related to translations. Translations of very, very important Indian texts. First one is translation of Bhagavad Gita by Charles Wilkin. Similarly, 5th, 6th, 7th, 8th, 9th. They were all translations of different texts by different Orientalists like Charles Wilkin, William Jones, H.S. Wilson. And these translations were also meant for knowing India. And last one, the 10th one, the Code of Gentoo Laws. That was a law digest prepared by N.B. Halhead. And this law digest was based on the laws of ancient times, what mainly we find in the Manu Smriti. So these all points are very, very important for your question in the preliminary examination. Now let's consider the next ideology. The next ideology is evangelicals. Evangelicals were a church group. They were very critical about India, Indian society, Indian religion. And they focused on social change on Western lines. They wanted social reforms on Western lines. They highlighted the idea of a spread of Western education. And their core concern was a spread of Christian ideas. And accordingly, they worked. So one important influence of evangelicals, what we find during this phase, is introduction of social changes on Western lines, like introduction of Western education in 1835. And the second important influence is introduction of a provision in the Charter Act of 1813 that allowed Christian missionaries' activities in India. So this is all about the role of evangelicals, and this is all about how they shaped British policies. And third one is utilitarians. Utilitarians focused on the idea of utility that was defined in terms of greatest happiness or greatest good for the greatest number. And they consider law as a powerful tool to ensure this. They focused on a centralized system. They focused on Raiyatwari, land revenue settlement, not Jamindari. And they focused on enactment of good laws. They focused on the institution of legislature as the supreme institution. And they also influenced British policies during this period. And all the points related to their influences are important for your exam. Take a look. This presentation is impact of utilitarians. So first important impact is abolition of sati in 1829 by Bentinck. And second is Widow Remarriage Act passed in 1856 during the Governor General Canning, though the draft of this was prepared during the Governor General Dalhousie. These two represent two important social laws, and utilitarians focused on good laws for social change. And as you have come to know, that abolition of sati 1829, this was work of the Governor General William Bentinck. And William Bentinck was a great representative of utilitarian ideas in India. Next one is centralization, as introduced in the Charter Act of 1833. Charter Act of 1833 was greatly influenced by utilitarian ideas. This is also an important point for the question. This act introduced political centralization, financial centralization, and legislative centralization. Next is Raiyatwari settlement, introduced in 1820s. A new settlement introduced in Madras, Bombay, and then some other areas. Utilitarians were anti-Jamindari settlement introduced by Cornwallis. Next one, legislature. The Charter Acts of 1833 and 1853 created modern legislature. Next one, Law Commission. There were provisions of Law Commission in the Charter Acts 1833 and 1853. The function of Law Commission was to prepare draft of law, and thus began the process of codification of law. And all the law codes, rather all the important law codes are important for your exam. Take a look. Number 7, codification of laws. Number 1, Indian Penal Code 1860. Next, Code of Civil Procedure 1859. Next is Code of Criminal Procedure 1861. And last one is Indian Evidence Act 1872. All these laws are important. So you should remember the year also here. And last important influence what we find is vernacular education. Utilitarians consider vernacular education more suited for Indian people. And the provision for vernacular education was there in the famous Wood's Dispatch 1854. So all these factual details are very, very important for your preliminary examination. Now let's consider the next ideology. And the next ideology is the last also in this presentation. That is white man's burden. This ideology was characterized by the idea of paternalism and trusteeship. British declared themselves as trustee of India. And they claimed that they were following a paternalistic approach towards Indian people. And they claimed that their basic motive in India was to develop India and to civilize Indian society. And this ideology became dominant 1858 onwards. And the term white man's burden literally was the claim of a moral burden on white people, because the white people being superior people, and this moral burden was related to the civilization of the backward society. So this is all about the ideologies, what you should focus for your preliminary examination. Now after this, I'm moving on to the next aspect important under British policies. And the next aspects are various acts. Various acts passed by the British during British rule, beginning Regulating Act 1773 and ending with the Indian Independence Act 1947. The provisions of these acts are very, very important for your preliminary examination. And you can expect 2-3 questions almost every year. Many acts were passed, but some were passed during Indian national movement. That is during the period 1885-1947. So the acts passed during Indian national movement were closely associated with the development of Indian national movement. So I will be throwing light on those acts in the lecture on the topic Indian national movement. So in this lecture, rest of the acts I am going to discuss. That means Regulating Act 1773 to Indian Councils Act 1861. Let's consider them. So first is the major provisions of Regulating Act 1773. Regulating Act 1773 was the first act passed by the British. And the purpose of this act was to regulate the affairs of the company. And so the name Regulating Act. First important point here is change in COD election. That is the election of Court of Directors, the supreme body in company's administration. And what was this change? 1 year to 4 years. Earlier, there was annual election. This means a member elected for 1 year. Now onwards, member elected for 4 years. Next point is collegiate government in Bengal that consisted of Governor General and his council of 4 members. The Governor of Bengal was made Governor General of Bengal. And there was a council of Governor General of Bengal, and this council had 4 members. So Governor General of Bengal and the 4-member council together played the role as the executive and the legislature. This is what we call collegiate government. Number 3 is centralization. And centralization means here the Governor General of Bengal and his council was given some powers and control over the other 2 presidencies, and they were Madras and Bombay. Madras presidency was headed by a governor, and Bombay presidency was also headed by a governor. And they too had their councils. But the status of the Governor of Bengal was elevated. He was made Governor General of Bengal. So this act marked the beginning of centralization. Next one is Supreme Court in Calcutta. Supreme Court was Crown's court. And next one is prohibition on acceptance of presents, gifts, etc. by company's officials. So this provision was meant for putting a check on corrupt practices. So this is all about the Regulating Act. Now I'm moving on to the next act. The next is Pitt's India Act, 1784. And here the provisions what you have to keep in your mind. Number 1, dual system of home government. Home government means company's government in London. The supreme body was Court of Directors. But now by this act, a new body was created, that was Board of Control. And the jurisdictions were separated. Earlier, Court of Directors had jurisdiction over all matters. And all matters means trade and commerce and territory and related judicial, revenue, military affairs of the territory. Now a change was introduced. Board of Control, a new body created, was entrusted with the task of governing the territories and related matters, military, revenue and civil. And Court of Directors jurisdiction was confined to only trade and commerce. So then there emerged a government on 2 lines. Line 1, Trade and Commerce under Court of Director, and line 2, Territory and Related Matters under Board of Control. Court of Directors represented a body of the company, whereas Board of Control represented a parliamentary body because all members were the members of the parliaments, and there were 2 cabinet ministers, and one among these 2 was the head of Board of Control, known as the President of Board of Control. And Court of Directors was headed by Chairman. So this is the beginning of dual government system in the home government that continued till the end of Company's rule, and Company's rule was ended in 1858. So till 1858, this dual government continued. Next one is Governor General of Bengal and Council of 3. In the previous act, the Council of the Governor General of Bengal consisted of 4 members. Now this was reduced to 3. Number 3 is further centralization, and that simply means that the Governor General of Bengal and his Council of 3 given more powers over the Madras and Bombay Presidency. And 4 is prohibition on aggressive wars by the company. So this act has a provision, and this provision put a check on the aggressive wars. So in fact, there was a direction given to the company in this act that company should not embark on the policy of wars and expansion. Now moving on to the next one. And next one is Charter Act 1813. And here the first point is enlargement of the powers of Board of Control created by Pitt-Sindhi Act. Next, abolition of trade monopoly of company excepting China trade and tea trade. Company had acquired monopoly rights of trade in East. Now this act abolished the monopoly rights of the company excepting the China trade and tea trade. And number 3, sovereignty of British Crown over company's territory. Company had acquired territories. Company had become ruler. Now by this act, the British Crown was made the sovereign of these territories. 4, grant for education, and that was rupees 1 lakh per annum. This was the official beginning of, you can say, education policy of the British. So, as per this provision, every year a grant of 1 lakh to be given to the company's government in India for development of education in India. Next is approval of Christian missionary activities. This shows the influence of the evangelicals I have discussed. Evangelicals focused greatly on a spread of Christian ideas. And for this, he considered it important to allow Christian missionaries activities. Before this, Christian missionary activities were not allowed within the territory of East India Company in India. Now let's consider next act. Next act is Charter Act 1833. This act shows great influence of utilitarian ideas. First point here is abolition of all trade monopoly of the company. The process of abolition of trade monopoly began in the Charter Act 1830. By that act, all monopolies excepting China trade and tea trade abolished, and the remaining monopolies abolished by this act. This means after this, the East India Company or the English East India Company had no monopoly, no trade monopoly at all. Next one, political centralization. This act is known for centralization in three fields: political, legislative, and finance. What was political centralization? The Governor General of Bengal was made the Governor General of India. And Governor General of India and his council was made the supreme authority within the company's territory in India. This is political centralization. Second, legislative centralization. Under this, all major law-making powers were vested in Governor General of India and his council. And this means the law-making powers of the Madras and the Bombay Presidency, besides one more presidency was created by this act, that was Agra Presidency, bifurcating apart from Bengal Presidency. So their law-making power were, in fact, ended to a great extent. And third, financial centralization. Under this, all financial powers were vested in Governor General of India and his council. So this act had three dimensions of centralization: political, legislative, and financial. Next is separation of legislative function. And this was also a very, very important move. This created nucleus of modern legislature. Modern legislature was developed by the provision of this act and the Charter Act of 1853. So this marked the beginning of the modern legislature. This simply means the Council of the Governor General of India was to function separately for executive affairs and for legislative affairs. Next one is law member. Introduction of a new member into the Governor General of India's Council. And this member was law member because the purpose of this member was to facilitate the process of making law. And this law member was Thomas Macaulay, the famous British official. And the purpose of Law Commission was to prepare draft of law. Next one, Law Commission. So Law Commission I have discussed already. There was a provision for establishment of Law Commission, whose purpose was to prepare draft of law. And the function of the law member was to facilitate this process. Now consider 3 points here. Point number 5, point number 6, and point number 7. They are associated with the law-making process. Creation of a body, but this body was not a new body, rather the same body functioning separately for lawmaking. Creation of Law Commission for making of the draft of law, and a law member in the Council of the Governor General of India for facilitating the process of making law. Besides, you find one more provision related to law, that is legislative centralization. Next is abolition of slavery. There was a provision regarding abolition of slavery in this act, and slavery was abolished in 1843. Next important feature is removal of restrictions on European immigration and acquisition of land and property, that is into India. And this created ground for the larger scale immigration of Europeans. Next one, provision that no disqualification for any office on the grounds of religion, race, color, and place of birth. So this was also progressive provision, you can say. Next one, British Crown as trustee of companies' possession in India. And I have discussed already that in the previous act, the sovereignty of the British Crown was established on the company's territory. I mean, the territory is acquired by company. Now Crown was made the trustee of all the territories acquired by the company. And next one, new designation to the President of Board of Control. I have discussed Board of Control. And this new designation was Minister for Indian Affairs. So this is all about the major provisions of the Charter Act 1833. Now let's consider the major provision of the Charter Act of 1853. And first point is the same, the British Crown as the trustee of company's territory in India. This was continued under this act. Number 2, COD membership reduced. There were 24 members in Court of Directors earlier. It was reduced to 18. Third, expansion of central legislature. The central legislature that was created by the Charter Act of 1833, but this central legislature was the Council of Governor General of India that function in two different ways. One, separate meeting for executive affairs and separate meeting for legislative affairs. So this separate meeting for legislative affairs, in this capacity, this council known as Central Legislature. And here the point is expansion of the Central Legislature. 6 official members were added. And these members were from outside, but they were officials. Next one, competitive exam for services. And services here means the higher civil services. So members of the higher civil services earlier were not appointed through the process of competitive exam. Now, they were to be appointed through a competitive exam. Next is, law member was made a full member. Full member means the member having right to vote. So law member was introduced in the Charter Act of 1833, but he didn't have right to vote in the council. Now he was made full member. That means he got right to vote. So this is all about the major provisions of Charter Act of 1853. Let's consider the next and the last. Oh, sorry, not last, second last. Major provisions of Act of 1858. This act is known as the Act for Better Government in India. This expression is also important for the exam. This act abolished the rule of the company and began the rule of the crown. The dual government under company, that was the government by Court of Directors and government by Board of Control, was abolished. And their powers were vested in a new office created, that was Secretary of State. Take a look. First point, end of East India Company's rule. Second, beginning of the rule by British Crown. Third, end of the dual government of Board of Control and Court of Directors. Four, a new office created, Secretary of State. And a council was created consisting of 15 members to assist Secretary of State. And this council was known as India Council. And the Governor General of India was given a new title, that is Viceroy. That means Crown's or British Crown's representative in India. So this act marked the end of one phase of British rule in India and marked the beginning of the second phase. Now let's consider next act. And next act is Indian Council Act 1861. So this was the first Indian Council Act, known as Council Act because the dominant provisions were related to Legislative Council. So first point here is expansion of Central Legislative Council by introducing non-official members. So Central Legislative Council created by Charter Act 1833, expanded by Charter Act 1853 by introducing official members, and further expanded by Indian Councils Act 1861 by adding non-official. Non-official means the members that were not the part of official machinery. Next one is creation of provincial legislative councils in Bengal, Northwest provinces, and Punjab in 1862, 1886, 1897 respectively. So before this act, the legislature existed at center only. This act had provision to establish legislature at provincial levels also, and in three: Bengal, Northwest provinces, and Punjab. Third is Governor General's power to issue ordinance. And this ordinance remained valid maximum for 6 months. An ordinance refers to making law directly by passing the legislature. Next is fifth member in Governor General's Executive Council. So before this, there were 4 members, you have come to know. Now a fifth member was also added. Now the term Executive Council and the term Central Legislative Council are two different terms. You have come to know that the same council played role in two different ways. And when it met for legislative function, it was known as Central Legislative Council. When it met for executive function, it was known as Executive Council. Fifth one is portfolio system. And under this, portfolios were allocated among the members of the Executive Council. Like you find the agricultural portfolio, defense portfolio, as you find a portfolio today also with respect to Council of Ministers. So this was a new system under which a specific subject placed under the jurisdiction of a specific member of the Executive Council of Governor General of India. And last one is legislative decentralization. So this act introduced legislative decentralization. Legislative centralization was introduced by Charter Act 1833, you have come to know. All major law-making powers vested in the center. But now, certain powers were given back to the provinces, and this refers to legislative decentralization. So I have discussed all the major provisions of all the acts, beginning with Regulating Act 1773 and ending with Indian Councils Act 1861. And all the provisions are important. The provisions of the other acts or the subsequent act I will be discussing in the lecture related to Indian national movement ladder. Now let's move on to next aspect of British policies. This presentation is on phases of colonialism. Now I am moving on towards certain economic dimensions that are important for your exam of British policies. This is one of them. So here what you are supposed to know, that the colonialism in India, or the British colonialism in India, acquired different character in different periods. And these periods are: first phase 1757-1813, second phase 1830-1860s, third phase 1860s, 1947. This simply means the basis of colonialism underwent a change. The instruments of colonialism underwent a change. Colonialism began in 1757 with British victory in the Battle of Plassey and ended in 1947 with India becoming free. So here 3 terms you are supposed to know, and those 3 terms are merchant capitalism, industrial capitalism, and finance capitalism. So merchant capitalism associated with first phase, industrial, second phase, finance, third phase. Besides this, I have also mentioned here certain expressions. Here you find monopoly trade and direct appropriation. So monopoly trade and direct appropriation was the basis of colonial exploitation during this time. Company had got monopoly rights. But these monopoly rights were gradually ended. First by Charter Act 1813, then by Charter Act 1833, and there began thereof free trade, 1813 onwards. And then there began thereof finance capitalism. So these expressions and terms and their respective chronology you are supposed to know under this. And straightway these terms could be a question, or there could be a question on this development, that is phases of colonialism. Let's consider next aspect. And next aspect is related to drain of wealth, also known as tribute. So drain of wealth or tribute refers to transfer of Indian resources to England, for which India got nothing adequate in return. And related to drain or tribute, what is important for your exam is the definition, what I have just now said. That is, transfer of resources from India to England, for which India received nothing in return or nothing adequate in return. And second thing important here is the constituents of drain. And here you find the list of the constituents. First is dividend to shareholders of English East India Company. This was one constituent of drain or tribute. Second is interest on public debt raised abroad for Indian government in India. Third, guaranteed interest on railways. Interest given on the private investment in railways. Next, pension given to retired British officers. Next, expenditure of India House. India House was the company's office in London, and this was the center of the governance of India from Britain. And next, civil and military purchases. There should be purchases from Britain. It could be paper for official purpose. It could be arms and ammunition. Next, part of salaries, bonus, etc. of British officers who served in India. Next one is part of appropriations and exactions. I mean, what the British appropriated from India in different forms. And last is trade profits due to monopolistic control. So these were the major constituent. Question could be, which of the following is the constituent of drain? So any of these is correct. Besides, there is a term home charges. And here in this list, number 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. 1 to 6 are the examples of home charges. So this term is also important for your question. Home charges refer to the expenditure that was incurred in Britain or that took place in Britain from Indian revenue. And this expenditure was associated with British government in India. So this was known as home charges. Consider first example, dividend to shareholders of East India Company. So these shareholders resided in Britain. So expenditure took place in Britain. But this was out of Indian revenue and this was associated with British government in India. Similarly, you find other examples also, 1 to 6. So with respect to the economic policy of drain, also known as tribute, just two things are important. 1, what was this? And 2, the major constituents. And one more point you can add, 3, the home charges. And one more significant point related to this, that the nationalistic leader Dadabhai Naoroji was the first who put a question mark on drain. He presented a theory, what is known as drain theory. And in that theory, he defined drain and he presented a vivid description of its adverse influences on Indian society and economy. Let's consider next aspect. Next aspect is the British trade policy. And under this aspect, you're supposed to know only 3 things. 1, that during the period 1757 to 1813, the trade policy or the British trade policy was marked by monopoly trade because the English company had monopoly rights over trade. Second thing, 1813 onwards, the British trade policy was marked by free trade because monopolies were abolished in 1813 and 1833. And the pursuance of the free trade policy was guided by Industrial Revolution in England. Industrial Revolution in England gave birth to new socio-economic forces. And they created a pressure on the British government to abolish control, to abolish regulation, to abolish monopoly. And related to this phase, 1813 onwards, next important thing is opium trade. The East India Company got involved in a trade process known as opium trade. This was trade with China. The company procured opium from India and sold the opium into China, and this was illegal trade because opium trade was not allowed in China. Opium trade of the company was meant for making the trade balance with China favorable for the company. And the last thing you are supposed to know here is a policy that was introduced in 1927. This is known as policy of imperial preference. After the First World War, there emerged several challenges to the British goods in British Empire. These challenges were posed by the goods from other European countries like France, Germany. So in order to make the trade favorable for the British goods, the British government introduced a new policy, and this new policy is known as policy of imperial preference. So under this policy, the British modified the tariff structure in such a way so that the British goods got encouragement and the goods from other European countries got discouragement. This means the tariffs on the goods from the other European countries were raised. Naturally, that would be putting a check on their entry into the British Empire. This policy was introduced in the British Empire. This means all the colonies of Britain. And this policy was formalized in Ottawa Imperial Conference 1932. So this is the last thing you are supposed to know. So just a few things here related to trade policy are important for you. And such trade policy was of course colonial and had adverse impact on traditional Indian trade. Now I'm moving on to the next important aspect for you under British policies, and this is also related to the economic dimensions of British policy. This is land revenue settlement. The Britishers introduced several new land revenue settlements, and these settlements are important for your exam. Take a look here. The first one is Ijardari, introduced by Warren Hastings in Bengal in 1772, and it continues till 1789. And here I have mentioned the region, that is Bengal, and here the name of the person who introduced. This was a contract system or revenue farming system known as Ijara system. So Ijardar was a contractor. Right to collect land revenue was given to a contractor known as Ijardar. But this system was not successful because Ijardar emerged as great exploiter. When this was introduced in 1772, the contract for 5 years was given. But when the contract was over after 5 years, it was made annual. This means contract for 1 year was given. Finally, this system was abandoned in 1789. And in 1790, a new system was introduced that is known as Jamindar. So this was first introduced in Bengal, replacing Ijardar. And the Governor General who introduced this system was Cornwallis. And two other British officials who were involved in this introduction were John Shore and James Grant. This settlement was with Jamindars. Under this, Jamindars were made the owner of the land. and they were given right to collect revenue. So the occupancy rights of the peasants were destroyed. Peasants were subordinated to the zamindar. So zamindars were supposed to collect rent from the peasants, and out of this, a fixed amount was to be paid to the company as land revenue. And zamindari system was made permanent in 1793. So what was introduced in 1790 was made permanent in 1793. That's why this system is known as permanent settlement. So permanent settlement was essentially zamindari settlement introduced in 1793 in Bengal and later in some parts of Madras. And this was introduced by the same Governor General Cornwallis. So what was the difference between permanent settlement and zamindari settlement? Under zamindari settlement, rate was not fixed for good or in perpetuity. Rate was to be revised from time to time. And this time was 10 years. But before the lapse of the 10-year period, this was made permanent. So no revision took place. So under permanent settlement, the rate was fixed for good. Rate was fixed in perpetuity, and this was not subject to any revision in future. So zamindari settlement became permanent settlement. And so finally, one major settlement emerged, that is permanent settlement. First introduced in Bengal and later in some parts of Madras. This also came to be known as Cornwallis system. And here I have mentioned as statistics, 19%. This data is based on a rough estimate of the first half of 20th century, according to which the cultivable land under permanent settlement constituted 19% of the total cultivable land. Then later, a new settlement was introduced, that is Raiyatwari. So this emerged as the second major settlement. This was introduced in 1820s, first in Madras, then in Bombay, then in Sindh, Assam, Kurg. And the main associated with this were Alexander Reed, who made first experiment in Raiyatwari, Thomas Munro, who introduced this in Madras, where he was governor, and M. Finston, who introduced this in Bombay, who was the governor there. And Raiyatwari settlement was with Raiyat. Raiyat means peasants. So under this, the Raiyats or the peasants were made owner of the land. And government collected land revenue directly from the Raiyats. Under this, the Patta system was introduced and survey and measurement were also introduced. So in this case, there was no intermediary like Jamindar, what you find. So under permanent settlement, land revenue passed from peasant to Jamindar and Jamindar to company. But here, land revenue passed from peasant to company directly. And this constituted 52% of the total cultivable land according to the same rough estimate what I have discussed. So maximum land came under Raiyatwari. And 1820s, the British introduced one more new system. Take a look. And this one is Mahalwari. As I have said, Mahalwari also introduced in 1820s, but in different regions. Northwest, Punjab, and Central India. The men who were associated with this system were Charles Metcalfe, Henry Maine, and Holt Mackenzie. And this was a system that was marked by settlement with Mahal. Mahal represented a village and later a group of villages. So this settlement was with Mahal or village, and the ownership was vested in the village community. And a few representatives were chosen to collect revenue and pass it on to the company. And this constituted 29% of the total cultivable land as per the rough estimate what I have discussed. So maximum land, cultivable land came under Raiyatwari, then under Mahalwari, and then under permanent settlement. So the three main settlements were permanent settlement, Raiyatwari settlement, and Mahalwari settlement that continued till end. The first two settlements, Ijardari and Jamindari, were not there. Jamindari was modified as permanent, and Ijardari was replaced by Jamindari. And later, two more settlements were introduced later, but they were minor. But I had mentioned, you should have the idea of this term. So one was Talukdari, 1860, 1871 in Awadh region. This was the settlement with Talukdas, who were Jamindar kind of elements in Awadh. And next was Malguzari, introduced in 1863 in central provinces. And this settlement was with Malguzar, and Malguzars were the traditional land revenue collectors. So you should just keep in your mind that Talukdari, which region, and Malguzari, which region. That's it. So, apart from these two, with respect to the rest, you should know certain other details also what I have discussed. So, Britishers experimented with many land revenue settlement, and acquisition of land revenue was a major concern because it was a major source of revenue in India. In fact, the British has two major concerns: appropriation of maximum revenue and promotion of trade. Now let's move on to the next. And next aspect is decline of handicrafts. India had a flourishing handicrafts of various types, like textile, for example. There was a huge demand of Indian handicrafts in the outside world as well. But the British rule destroyed it. And this event is known as decline of handicrafts. And in the destruction of handicrafts, two forces played a role. One is the anti-handicrafts policy of the British, like suppression of craftsmen, export of raw materials, import of British goods, creating tough competition with Indian handicrafts, and special privileges given to British manufacturers in India. And the second force is favorable colonial condition, like disappearance of princely courts. Result of this was the fall of demand that was associated with the princely courts and their members. Second, decline of guilds. Guilds played an important role in organization of craft. Next, Europeanized pattern of demands. A new pattern of demand emerged, and this was European, like in the place of turban, hat, in the place of dhoti, trousers. And Indian craftsmen were not having expertise in producing them. And next is railways. Railways played important role in colonial exploitation, including destruction of handicrafts, because railways became important channel for exporting raw materials from India and importing British finished goods to India. So export of raw materials created a scarcity of raw materials in India, important for the development of handicrafts. And import of British goods created tough competition in Indian market with the handicrafts, where they lost because machine-made goods were cheaper. And decline of handicrafts was not just an urban phenomenon, rural phenomenon as well. This created a great pressure on agriculture also, because a good number of artisans shifted to agriculture sector. This resulted into fall of many important craft centers and urban centers. And this was a great loss. And in this context, it is said that during British rule, India witnessed a process, what is given the name deindustrialization. So deindustrialization refers to the fall of handicrafts as a result of British policies and British colonial conditions, and very limited growth of modern industries, thus creating a potential loss and just creating a potential loss in the industrial capacity of India. Now I am moving on to the next one. Next aspect is commercialization of agriculture. There is another important aspect of the British policy, representing the economic dimension of British policy. The British promoted commercialization of agriculture. Three objectives were there. One, to expand their trade by incorporating agricultural products. Two, to support industrialization in Britain. And three, to support their China trade by promoting the cultivation of opium. So the British promoted cultivation of cash crops or commercial crops like cotton, indigo, jute, opium, etc. And this promotion was meant for fulfillment of three objectives, as I have said. And this policy had quite adverse impact on the peasants and the rural economy. This adversely affected the self-sufficient rural economy because this has dampening impact on the production of the food crops. This made peasantry linked to the market forces, and the fluctuations of the market forces had adverse impact on the peasantry. This linked peasantry to various kinds of intermediaries, and they backed the big profit out of this. So commercialization, though this was not a new phenomenon, yet it was quite exploitative, and exploitative because it was colonial. So under commercialization of agriculture, you should remember three objectives and its adverse impact. Now I'm moving on to the next aspect, and that is related to major famines, committees and commissions. Famines were a recurrent phenomenon during British rule. And it is considered these famines were not natural calamities, rather the product of British policies. British land revenue settlements, new ones, and commercialization of agriculture adversely affected food grain production and the status of the peasantry, creating famine conditions. And the British famine policy was initially, for a long time, you can say, whole of the period of the company's rule was just to provide some relief. During Crown's rule, the British began to form certain committees and commissions. And they worked on the basis of the recommendation of these committees and commissions. But this work was very, very limited. In many cases, recommendations were skipped over and neglected. So famine policy was quite inadequate. It failed to prevent famine and it failed to provide desired support to the peasants. So here what is important for you is to know about some major committees and commissions on famines. Plus here I have presented some major famines also. Maybe some questions are linked with that. So first one is 1769-70, a major famine in Bengal. Second, 1784, major famine in North India. Third, 1803, major famine in Northwest Province and Awadh. 4, 1833, major famine in Guntur. And fifth onwards, you find the process of formation of committees and commissions on famine. And that was normally after the occurrence of the famine. So fifth one is 1860-61. Famine took place in the area between Delhi and Agra. And the first committee on famine was formed, Baird-Smith Committee. But its recommendations were highly neglected. So what you are supposed to know here is the name of this committee. And of course, question could be this way also. The name of a committee is given and question is this was associated with what? Famine, education, this way. Next one, 1866, Great Famine in Odisha. And a committee was formed, that was George Campbell Committee. Next 7, famine in 1877-78 in many provinces, Uttar Pradesh, Punjab, Madras, Bombay. Sorry, this shouldn't be Uttar Pradesh, this should be United Provinces. By mistake, there should be UP. During those days, there was no Uttar Pradesh, there was United Province. And a committee, rather a commission was formed, that was Richard Strachey Commission in 1880. This was the most important commission formed till now. And the recommendation of this commission created the basis for a famine policy. And this famine policy was characterized by mainly two things. One, a famine code was formulated. This created a broad framework for famine policy. And two, a famine fund was created. That's all. And this was all in 1880s. So we find first time in 1880s the beginning of a British famine policy. Next one is famine in 1896-97 in all provinces. And a commission was constituted, James Loyal Commission. Next, number 9, famine in 1900. Again, here we find famine in all provinces, and a commission was formed, that was Anthony MacDonald Commission. And last is 1942-43, a great famine in Bengal, and John Woodhead Commission was formed. This was the last major. So John Woodhead Commission was the last major on famine, and Baird-Smith was the first on famine. So you should be keeping in mind the names of the committees, and plus so many famines, no need to remember the years, but a broad idea should be there. Besides, I have said that a famine policy had two major aspects: famine code and famine fund. So this you should keep in your mind. Now I'm moving on to the next one. And the next aspect is the trends of social policy. And here you should have a broad idea because you may have a statement kind of question related to this. Here you find various phases are there. There should be 1772 to to 1813. Then 1813, 1858, 1858, 1885, 1885, 1947. So in the first phase, the social policy was the policy of no social change on Western lines and policy to maintain Indian social tradition, including educational tradition. This was the phase when we find influences of the Orientalist. So this is phase 1, maintenance of Indian social tradition, conservative attitude, to conserve what was there in India, no change on Western line, and policy of non-interference in social field. So during this phase, British did not interfere in the social educational field of India. But in the next phase, we find so many changes. They began to interfere, but in a limited way. They began to introduce social changes, social reforms on Western lines. They introduced Western education. They allowed Christian missionaries. And in such changes, various ideologies played a role, and two are important. One, evangelicals, and two, utilitarians. So in the second phase, 1813, 1858, find social changes on Western lines. This was, in fact, a cautious and partial modernization. Cautious because they were cautious in introducing changes also, because they feared that maybe these changes would produce orthodox reaction. And third, this was a colonial modernization because it was guided by colonial motives. And here in these changes, I hope you remember also so many things, that all the major social changes and reforms what you find introduced by British, that you find during this period, 1813-58, like allowing Christian missionaries, like introduction of Western education in 1835, like abolition of sati by Benty, like Widow Remarriage Act. All these you find here, like abolition of slavery, abolition of infanticide. So why so? Because the Britishers were influenced now by the idea of several those ideologues like evangelicals, utilitarians, liberals, etc. And the idea was now to change India slightly, to modernize India slightly, so that India could be exploited in a better way. If India remained traditional as it was, the traditional India would not be appreciating the things British. So change India slightly, modernize India slightly, this became the motto. And next, in the third phase, 1858, 1885, we find they became very cautious as regards social reform. And they became indifferent to social reforms also. And they began to support the orthodox elements of the society. Why this change? Because the revolt of 1857 played a role. Britishers considered that the several social changes introduced during this phase played a role in giving rise to the Great Revolt of 1857. So they changed their policy. Now the policy is indifference to social change and support to orthodox opinion. And in the last phase, 1885 onwards till 1947, this is the phase of Indian National Movement. Indian National Congress was founded, nationalistic leaders emerged, and they were progressive. And Indian National Movement was just not a political movement, it had socio-economic dimensions as well. So social reforms took place under nationalist initiatives during this phase. So this is all about the trends of social policies. And under social policies, one important aspect is education policy. So I'm going to throw light on the education policy. In fact, what is important for your preliminary examination is the entire development of the education policy, including certain committees and commissions. Take a look. Development of education policy. Here all points are important for your preliminary examination. First is Charter Act 1830. In this act, there was a provision for the grant of rupees 1 lakh per annum for the development of education. Second, 1823. Creation of General Committee on Public Instruction, having 10 members. So a separate body was created for the development of education. And the sum of rupees 1 lakh was given at the disposal of this committee. Among these 10 members, there were some members who supported the idea of Western education in India. They are known as Anglicists. And there were some other members who supported the idea of Oriental learning or Indian learning based on Indian educational system. They were known as Orientalists. So there began a conflicting situation. This conflicting situation is known as Orientalist-Anglicist controversy. So Orientalist-Anglicist controversy was associated with the British education policy. And this was essentially what? Conflict between two groups among the British, and they were a part of this. But in this conflict, finally, Anglicists emerged victorious. And the result of this was next, that is 3/1835, Macaulay's Minute. This name Macaulay is after the name Thomas Macaulay, who became the first law member, I have said. So Thomas Macaulay was a great advocate of Western education. His idea was that the Indian learning was useless. He prepared a broad framework of Western education known as Macaulay's Minute, and this was approved by William Bentinck, the Governor General, in 1835, and thus began the Western education system in India. And Macaulay's system was characterized by theory of downward filtration. Western education, you understand. Macaulay presented the idea that there was no need to educate all Indians. They presented the objective. I mean, those Britishers who were supporters of Western education, whose main protagonist was Thomas Macaulay. So they presented the idea that the education would be imparted to the top, the elite of the Indian society. And from this top class and the elite class, education will percolate down to all the Indians. This theory is known as theory of downward filtration. This was again a colonial theory because officers like Macaulay didn't want to spend much on education, and educating whole of India required a huge expenditure. This theory was abandoned in Wood's dispatch in 1854. But before that, next point is in 1842, a Council of Education was created and another body to promote education. Next is very, very important development, 1854, Wood's dispatch. The dispatch by Wood, name is Charles Wood, and Charles Wood presented a very broad framework of education. This is commonly known as Magna Carta, or the Great Charter of Indian education during British period. And in this dispatch, we find certain important things like one, provision for vernacular education, Macaulay's Minute focused on Western and on English. 2 graded system like primary, secondary, this way. 3 university, and on the recommendation of Wood Dispatch, the first universities was founded in Calcutta, Bombay and Madras in 1857. Next is provision for private initiatives and provision for vocational education. So here we find certain progressive elements are related to education system, but they were not implemented in a proper way. Next development after this is number 6, 1882, a commission was constituted, Hunter Commission. And it recommended, number 1, women's education, private initiatives, primary and secondary education. Next is 1902, Raleigh Commission. This was on university education, and its recommendation led to passing of Indian Universities Act 1904 during the period of the Viceroyalty of Karjan. Next is 1917, Sadler Commission, and its recommendations were related to school to university education. Number 9 is Hartog Committee, and Hartog Committee was a subcommittee of the Indian Estates Committee known as Butler Committee I have discussed. And this presented recommendation related to school to university education. And last, 1944, Sargent Plan, and this was related to primary to higher secondary education. So related to education, now every point is important. Each committee is important. Macaulay's Minute is important, downward filtration theory, Wood's Dispatch. I mean, everything you have to keep in your mind for preliminary examination. And this I have presented in sequence like 1, 2, 3, 4, and that shows the chronological sequence. This will help you remember as well. Now let's move on to next. And next is Major Press Act. Here just one thing is important, that you should know that in these years, like 1799, 1857, 1878, 1908, 1910, 1931, major press acts were introduced. British pursued a press policy that aimed at curtailing the powers of the press, particularly when the press was involved in anti-government activities. And with the rise of Indian nationalism, 1870s onwards, there arose a good number of vernacular and English press, and they were nationalist in character. And with the rise of Indian national movement, 1885 onwards, we find almost all the national leaders or major national leaders used press as an important instrument for propagation of nationalist ideas. So the British policy from the beginning was hostile to press, but it became more hostile to nationalistic press. So here, the major press acts were passed during these years. 1. Censorship of Press Act 1799. 2. Licensing Act 1857. 3. Vernacular Press Act 1878. 4. Newspaper Act 1908. 5. Indian Press Act 1910. And 6. Indian Press Emergency Powers Act 1931. And here, 2 are very, very important for you. Number 3, Vernacular Press Act 1878, passed by Lytton, the Governor General. And this was a part of Lytton's anti-nationalist policy. Purpose was to put a check on the vernacular press. This press was arising and propagating the ideas of nationalism during this time. And the second one, very important, is 6, Indian Press Emergency Power Act, 1931. This was passed during civil disobedience movement that began in 1930 and continued till 1934. So this was a move to weaken press and thus to weaken civil disobedience movement. And one more aspect I'm going to discuss. And that aspect is in fact the result of many British policies. Since this aspect appears to be important for the preliminary examination, so I have presented here. This is rise of new social classes. British rule characterized by British policies, political, economic, social, created favorable condition for rise of new social classes, both in rural areas and urban areas. And under this, certain policies played very important role, like new education policy, introducing Western modern education, 2 new politico-administrative system, and 3 new economic policies like commercialization of agriculture, mining policy, trade policy, etc. These 3 played important role in giving birth to new social classes. I have presented here 2 heads, new social classes in rural areas and new social classes in urban areas. So in rural areas, the new classes that emerged: 1, new class of zamindars; 2, absentee zamindars; 3, new class of peasant proprietors; 4, new class of tenants; 5, new class of moneylenders. Here you will find these zamindars, peasant proprietors, tenants, and moneylenders. They were in existence even before the British rule. But I have mentioned here, new class. But these zamindars, what I have mentioned, these peasant proprietors, these tenants, these moneylenders, were a different class. Their status, form, function were completely modified. So zamindars during the British period were different from the zamindars during Mughal period. New class of zamindars emerged out of zamindari settlement. Absentee zamindars also emerged out of zamindari settlement, because when the zamindars failed to pay land revenue in time, his zamindari or his right to collect was auctioned to the highest bidder. And this highest bidder could be a merchant, a moneylender living in urban area. So in this case, a merchant or a moneylender becoming zamindar, but becoming an absentee zamindar because not associated with land, living away from the village in urban area. New class of peasant proprietor was the result of Raiyatwari settlement. New class of tenants, result of zamindari settlement. New class of money lenders, result of all these policies. And in urban area, number 1, rise of capitalist class, merchant, industrial, financier. And this was the result of new economic policies related to industrialization, finance, and trade. Next, rise of modern labor. This was the result of rise of modern industries, though very limited. And next, rise of educated middle class and intelligentsia. This was the result of new economic system, new education system, and new politico-administrative system also. So this is all about the rise of new social classes as a result of British policies in rural areas and in urban areas. So this is the last aspect. So under British policies, there are many aspects. And here what you find is selection. But this selection is also very broad. And within this selection, you find further selection. That means, suppose, drain. So what things are important for the exam? Suppose commercializations of what things? Educations of what things? Acts of what things? Accordingly, I have discussed so that this all become concise and it becomes convenient for you to revise the things. Good study. Hello everyone. This is the first lecture on Indian national movement. And in this lecture, I am going to throw light on all trends of Indian national movement important for you from 1885 to 1990. And accordingly, the title of this lecture is Indian National Movement, Part 1. And you know very well, Indian national movement began in 1885 with the foundation of Indian National Congress and continued till 1947 when India became free, at the same time got partition. So in this part, I will be covering this period, 1885 to 1919. So this is almost half of the Indian national. Now let's consider the important aspects for your exam. So first I am going to throw light on Indian national movement from 1885 to 1905. This is known as the early phase of Indian national movement, or you can call it the first phase. And in 1885, Indian National Congress was founded. And Indian National Congress became the platform of the Indian national movement. So first point we should keep in your mind is Indian National Congress founded in 1885 and its predecessors or the political organization that emerged before the foundation of Indian National Congress in 1885. And the idea here is that the political organizations that emerged before Indian National Congress provided a ground for foundation of Indian National Congress. In fact, the process of the rise of modern political organization got culminated into foundation of Indian National Congress in 1885. So take a look. I have presented here 7 such political organizations that emerged before INC. Here the first 2 are considered the earliest ones. Bangabhasa Prakasika Sabha 1836 and Landholders Society 1838. And then 3, East India Association 1866, founded by Dada Bhai Nauroji. Then 4, Pune Sarvajanik Sabha 1870, founded by M.G. Ranade and others. And 5, Indian Association 1896. This should be 1876. 1876 by S.N. Surendranath Banerjee and Anand Mohan Bose. And 6, Madras Mahajan Sabha 1884 by G. Subramaniam Iyer, Anand Charlu and M. Veera Kavachari. And last, Bombay Presidency Association 1885 by Firoz Shah Mehta, K.T. Telang, and Badruddin Tyabji. So the important point for you is not the ES. No need to memorize these ES. We should know the earliest ones were Banga Bhasa, Prakasika Sabha, and Landholders Society. And most consider that this was the first proper modern political organizations. We should remember this name, and we just remember 1830s in a state of 1838. And then you should know the names of these organizations and the associated leaders like Dadabhai Nauroji, M.G. Rana, D.S.N. Banerjee, etc. And these years are never important for any question. So you should focus on the first, particularly Landholders Society, and we should remember that it was in 1830s. And then we should know these names and associated leaders. That's it. Now let's consider the next point. So next point is safety wall. You should remember that safety wall theory is associated with the foundation of Indian National Congress. This was a particular reference, you can say, what we find in the biography of A.O. Hume written by William Wedderburn in 1930. And safety wall theory remained explanation for the foundation of Congress for a long time till independence. So simply one point is required, that safety wall theory associated with what and whose reference created the basis of this theory. That's it. And third is A.O. Hume. A.O. Hume was associated with Indian National Congress as the chief organizer. And after this, the point number 4 is rather more important for you. This is moderates or early nationalist. The Congress leadership during this time, 1885 to 1905, is known as the moderates or the early nationalist. Leaders like Dadabhai Nauroji, Surendranath Banerjee, R.C. Dutt, Gopal Krishna Gokhale, etc. represented moderates or early nationalists. And about moderates and early nationalists, their programs, their demands could be a theme of the question. So your focus should be that what types of demands they presented and what all they did. So under moderates or early nationalists, number A is economic critic, very, very important. Economic critic refers to the criticism of the British economic policies and their impact on India. And this included the drain theory, commercialization of agriculture, land revenue settlements, etc., etc. And Dadabhai Nauroji was the first to present this. Then many other leaders also got associated, like G.B. Joshi, M.G. Ranade, Gopal Krishna Gokhale, R.C. Dutt. And here you should also remember the names of 3 books. And these 3 books are closely associated with the economic critic. One is Poverty and Un-British Rule in India by Dadabhai Nauroji. Second is Essays on Indian Economy by M.G. Ranade. And third is The Economic History of India by R.C. Dutt. Then the second point we should know is reform in legislature. The early nationalists focused on the reform in legislature. They wanted legislature to be a representative body of the Indians, having wide powers. Next is Indianization of higher services. Next, separation of judiciary from executive. Next, civil rights that included freedom of speech and freedom of press. So these ticked ones are important points related to the moderates. And moderates are known as moderates because their political approach was one of moderation. They believe in the methods such as presenting petitions, applications, resolutions, critique through press, and their idea was a gradual realization of the self-government. So here important point is that what demands were presented by the moderates or the early nationalists. So answer is B, C, D, and E, that is civil rights. And economic critique associated with whom? Answer is early nationalist. And what is economic critique? This also you should know. And some important names associated also. And next point is British Committee of INC, 1889. So this was a committee of INC, that is Indian National Congress, founded in 1889 in London. And the purpose of this was to make political propaganda in Britain. And last point, number 5, is Indian Consuls Act, 1892. The British government passed an act, that was Indian Consuls Act 1892, known as Consuls Act because it had legislature, a centric provision, and the moderates or the early nationalists focused on the reform in legislature. So enactment of this act was because of the pressure of the moderates. And regarding this act, you should remember 3 major provisions. Number 1 is expansion of the legislature, both central and provincial. 2, expansion of the powers of the legislature, both central and provincial. For example, the power to discuss budget, the power to present questions related to public issues. And 3rd, introduction of indirect election. An introduction of indirect election was a very, very important move because for the first time then in India, there began a process of election, but of course in direct form. And here about Indian National Movement 1885 to 1905, these are the only points you are supposed to focus for the preliminary examination. Now I'm moving to next one. Next one is Indian National Movement 1905 to 1907. So related to Indian National Movement of this phase, only 4 things are to be focused. One is partition of Bengal. Curzon partitioned Bengal and claimed that Bengal was a big province, so it was partitioned for administrative convenience. But the basic motive was to weaken Bengali nationalism, whose hotbed was Calcutta, that was the British capital or the capital of British India during those days. And this work of Curzon is considered as a great anti-nationalist work. And this backfired completely because this gave birth to anti-partition movement that came to be known as Swadesi movement. Next point is extremist, also known as militant nationalist. Extremist or the militant nationalist represented a group of Congress leadership like Bal Gangadhar Tilak, Bipin Chandra Pal, Lala Lajpat Rai, Aurobindo Ghosh, Ashwini Kumar Dutt, etc. And this group had a different vision of nationalistic struggle, and different means different from the vision of the moderates. They were not believer in the approach of political moderation. Rather, they were believer in political militancy and extremism. They were not believer in reforms. They were believer in Swaraj. They were believer in mass mobilization and mass movement. They focused on self-reliance, self-pride, national honor, and they focused on fight for assertion of rights rather than what they call begging for that. They considered moderates' methods as political mendicancy, and they criticize it. And they assume leadership in anti-partition movement. Next one is Swadesi movement. As I have said, that partition of Bengal gave birth to anti-partition movement. This came to be known as Swadesi movement. This began in 1905, in the same year when the Bengal was partitioned. And this movement emerged as the first mass movement under Indian national movement. So related to Swadesi movement, there are certain points important for your exam. Let's consider them. Swadesi movement that began on 7th August 1905. Here, part 1. In fact, I have presented this in 2 parts. So in part 1, I have presented the broad features that could be options in your question. One is, this movement progressed under moderates. You understand who were moderates. Then it progressed under extremists. And then the revolutionaries became dominant finally. So it progressed under 3 ideological groups. And among these 3, moderates were the part of Indian National Congress. Extremists too were the part, also known as militant nationalists. But revolutionaries were not the part of Indian National Congress. They were outside this. I'm going to discuss revolutionaries as well. Second is Swaraj. Swaraj refers to self-rule. So this movement stood for Swaraj. And Congress adopted the goal of Swaraj in 1906. And Dadabhai Nauroji was the president of Congress session in this year. And he proclaimed this goal in 1906. So 1885 to 1905, the goal of the Congress was reforms. But in 1906, Swaraj became the goal. And next is mass movement. Moderates were not believer in mass movement, considering the Indian national movement being in its infancy. But Swadesi movement became a mass movement finally. 4, boycott. That means boycott of British goods. 5, Swadesi. This means promotion of things Indian. It could be related to cultural field, economic field, social field, scientific field. Next, Atma Shakti. This idea was given by Rabindranath Tagore. And the essence of the idea was self-reliance. And this was essentially inspired by the idea of Swadesi, you can say. Because the idea of Swadesi and Atma Shakti, they were linked. Next one, passive resistance. When boycott and Swadesi not considered highly fruitful, then many extremist leaders gave the call of passive resistance. That means resistance through non-violent means. And under this, the leaders urged the people to not to cooperate with the government. And this way, to paralyze the government. Next one is women and students. Women and students became two important pillars of this movement. And this marked the beginning of the active role of a student and women in Indian national movement. Both played a role in Swadesi and boycott. And last is the reason where we find the spread of the movement. The main center was Bengal, but it is spread beyond Bengal. Maharashtra, Madras, Andhra region, Punjab, and Delhi region. In Maharashtra, the main leader was Bal Gangadhar Tilak. In Punjab, main leader was Lala Lajpat Rai and Ajit Singh. So this is part one. Now in part two of the Swadesi movement, I have presented some specific factual details important for you. And these details are associated with the broad features what I have discussed, mainly with the idea of Atmasakti and Swadesi. First is Amar Sonar Bangla. This was written by Rabindranath Tagore for the purpose of mourning of partition of Bengal. The day it came into effect. The partition of Bengal came into effect on 16th October 1905. This was celebrated as a day of mourning. And for this purpose, Amar Sonar Bangla was written by Rabindranath Tagore. And this became, you can say, a popular song sung by people on the streets. Second popular song what we find is Bande Mataram, written by Bankim Chand much earlier. So these two became two popular songs sung by people while protesting. So people on a street began to sing these two. Second is Raksha Bandhan. Raksha Bandhan was celebrated in a new way. The people tied Rakhi on the hands of one another. And this included both Hindus and Muslims as a mark of unity and solidarity. So Raksha Bandhan celebration in a new way became a feature of Swadesi movement. Next is Samitis. Samitis refer to societies. A good number of Samitis were founded and their work was to spread Swadesi masses and to promote the idea of Atmasakti. One important Samiti was Swades Bandhav Samiti at Barisal in Bengal. Next is Jatras. Jatras refer to Bengali folk drama. This was also used for propagation of Swadesi ideas. Next, Shivaji and Ganpati festivals started by Bal Gangadhar Tilak. And these festivals were meant for inspiring people for nationalistic struggle. Next, Bengal National College, whose principal was Aurobindo Ghosh, an important Swadesi leader. Under Swadesi and Atmasakti idea, there was a focus on national education. I have said there was a focus on things India in all fields. So in the field of education also, there was a focus on national education. And foundation of Bengal National College, whose principal was Aurobindo Ghosh, was a move towards making national education important. And similarly, number 8, foundation of National Council of Education in 1906. The purpose of this body was to organize national education. Next is Bengal Chemical Factory. This was founded by famous scientist P.C. Ray. 10th is, this is the period when we find the works of the famous scientist Jagdish Chandra Bose. And 11th, Abanindranath Tagore's nationalistic painting. Abanindranath Tagore emerged as a painter that focused on nationalistic painting. He refuted the idea of and the elements of and the pattern of the Western painting styles. And he took inspiration from the painting of Ajanta, Mughal, and other Oriental painting like painting in Japan, China, Southeast Asia. So his painting school is known as Bengal Painting School because it began in Bengal. It's also known as nationalistic painting because this was, you can say, an expression of Indian nationalism in art. So these are some specific points important for your questions related to Swadeshi movement. Now let's consider the next one. The next point here is Surat split. You have come to know that the extremist, a group of Congress leaders having different vision of nationalistic struggle, different from that of the moderates. So within Congress, there was an ideological conflict between the ideology of moderates and the ideology of extremists. And result of this was finally a split in the Congress that took place in Surat session in 1907. This is known as Surat split. The immediate cause of the split was the issue of presidentship. And this issue had emerged in 1906 itself. There was a conflict between moderates and extremists as regards who will be elected as the Congress president in 1906. But this conflict was resolved by accepting Dadabhai Nauroji by both, moderates and extremists. But this issue emerged again in 1907 when Ras Bihari Ghosh was elected as the president. That was in Surat session, and this became the immediate cause of the split, though this split was essentially an ideological split. This split weakened the Indian national movement because this weakened Indian National Congress, that was the platform of Indian national movement. So this is all about Indian national movement 1905-1907. Now let's move further. And that is revolutionary movement. I have said that the Swadeshi movement in Bengal progressed under three ideologies. First under moderates, then the extremists, finally the revolutionary. Revolutionary movement refers to a form of national movement outside Indian National Congress based on the ideology of violence. Revolutionary movement began in early 20th century and continued till 1940s with breaks. And these breaks are early 20th to 1915, that represent the first phase of revolutionary movement. Then 1922 to or 22, or you can say after 22 to early 30s. This represents the second phase. And finally, in 1940s, that represent the third phase. So there were three phases. Phase 1, early 20th to 1915. Phase 2, 1922 till early 30s. And phase 3, 1940s. This is the first thing you should remember. This was not a continuous movement. In the first phase, this spread to the areas outside India, like Europe, Canada, United States. In the second phase, the North India was the main reason. And two broad groups emerged. One was represented by Hindustan Socialist Republican Association, founded in 1928, where you find the revolutionaries like Chandrasekhar Azad, Bhagat Singh. And second group was the group led by Surya Sen in Bengal, that was involved in Chatgaon Armory rape. And in the third phase, this movement was represented by Indian National Army, or Azad Hind Fauj military operation under the leadership of Subhash Chandra Bose. So this information, what I have given you just now, will help you answer some question related to revolutionary movement. Apart from this, the next thing what you are supposed to know under revolutionary movement is the secret societies. The revolutionary movements were characterized by 1. Secret societies, 2. Cult of bomb and pistol, you can say cult of violence, 3. Revolutionary journals, magazines, newspapers, 4. Killing of unpopular British officials. So this movement rested on violence, different from the Congress movement. The moderates and the extremists, what you have come to know, did not base their movement on violence. So revolutionaries and the moderates and militants were different in this respect. Besides, they were also different because the militants and the moderates were the part of Congress. The revolutionaries were not the part of the Congress. They had different platforms, and these platforms were these societies. One more thing, the militant nationalist or the extremist like Tilak, Lal Lajpat Rai, etc., and the revolutionaries like Bhagat Singh, Chandrasekhar Azad, etc., were different in two respects. One, that the former was the part of Congress, the latter was not the part of Congress. And two, the former didn't believe in violence, while the latter believed in violence. This point or these points of differences also important for your question. So the platforms of the revolutionary movement were various samitis. So you should remember the name of these samitis. So one, Anusilan Samiti, Calcutta. There was one more Anusilan Samiti, Dhaka. The founder was Pulin Das. Period is roughly the same. Third, Jugantar, also Calcutta. So first three associated with Bengal region. The fourth one, Abhinav Bharat, Nasik, founded by V.D. Savarkar, who was a Maharashtrian revolutionary. And 1 to 4 represent the secret samitis that acted as the platform for the revolutionary movement in the first phase, that is early 20th to 1950. And next important is fifth, that is Hindustan Socialist Republican Association, founded in 1928, where you find the revolutionaries like Bhagat Singh, Chandrasekhar Azad. And this was associated with the second phase. And in the third phase, you find Indian National Army under Subhash Chandra Bose. But that was not a secret society. So these were the secret societies whose name, and in some cases, their reason and their founders and associated revolutionaries like Bhagat Singh, Chandrasekhar Azad, you should remember. So here you are supposed to remember the names of these samitis, belonging to what phase, but no need to memorize years, and what reason, and what associated revolutionaries. That's it. Now, next thing you should know related to revolutionary movement is revolutionary activities outside India. Here you are supposed to know the reason and what Indian revolutionaries were associated. And this is all related to the first phase. So first is London, Shyamaji Krishna Verma. Second is Paris and Geneva, Madam Bikaji Kama. Third is Berlin, Virendranath Chattopadhyay. Fourth is Vancouver, Tarak Nath Das. And fifth is San Francisco, Sohan Singh Bhakna and Hardaya. And San Francisco, as the base, emerged a movement that is known as Gadar movement. In 1913. So the center of Gadar movement was San Francisco. They spread to many regions also. And Hardayal was a major leader, revolutionary of Gadar movement. Sohan Singh Bhakna was one major revolutionary associated with the Gadar movement. The aim of the Gadar movement was to end British rule from all the colonies. And next thing, what you are supposed to know related to revolutionary movement is the name of the women revolutionaries. So women in revolutionary movement. One, Madam Bikaji Kama, who played role in the first phase outside India. Just now I have discussed. Second, Pritilata Wadedar. Third, Kalpana Dutt. Fourth, Shanti Ghosh. 5, Suniti Chaudhary. 6, Beena Das. And they were all associated with the second phase, mainly with the revolutionary group headed by Surya Sen in Bengal. So the revolutionary group headed by Surya Sen was remarkable for the involvement of many women revolutionaries. And next, Lakshmi Swaminathan, later known as Lakshmi Sehgal, was associated with Azad Hind Fauj movement. And last is Suhasini Ganguly. So these names you should remember related to revolutionary movement. Now I am moving to the next one. And the next is Indian National Movement during 1906-1990. In fact, I am moving chronologically. for your better understanding. The period 1906-7 to 1919 witnessed development of many trends inside Indian National Congress and outside Indian National Congress as well. Both are important for you, and I'm going to discuss them chronologically. And I've presented this in chronological manner. So first here you find is 1906. So in 1906, two important developments. One, goal of Swaraj. Congress with its president, Dadabhai Naoroji, proclaimed Swaraj as a goal in 1906. Two, foundation of Muslim League. And this emerged as a separate organization for Muslims, and it claimed to represent the interest of the Muslims. Next year, 1907, Surat is split. I have discussed. Next one, 1909, passing of Indian Councils Act. This was the third Indian Councils Act. First was Indian Councils Act 1861. Second was Indian Councils Act 1892, I have discussed. And third was Indian Councils Act 1909. And some important provisions related to this act are important for you. Let's consider them first. So Indian Councils Act 1909. And I have said such acts known as Councils Act because they had legislature-centric provisions. So first is expansion of legislature. Legislatures at both the level, central and provincial, were expanded. This means increase in their strength. Second is expansion of the powers of legislatures. So there was certain expansion in the past, and that was also related to asking questions on matters of public importance and related to budget. Next is introduction of direct election. This was a very important move. Indirect election was introduced by Indian Councils Act 1892 and direct election by this act. Next is introduction of class/separate electorates for Muslims. This was an official support to Muslim separatism. Muslim League was already founded in 1906. And the foundation of League claiming to represent the interest of Muslims was, in a sense, separatist move. And Britishers believed in the policy of divide and rule. Next one. And here one term is there, separate electorates. So I should define this also for your revision purpose, that separate electorates refer to reserving a constituency from where only the Muslim candidates could fight, because this was for Muslims, and only Muslim voters could vote the Muslim candidates. This is the concept of separate electorates for Muslims introduced. And this was later expanded, for example, for Sikhs. So similar provision applied. Next one, introduction of one Indian member each in Governor Generals and Governors Executive Council. So in the Executive Council of Governor General of India or Viceroy, and in the Executive Council of Governors of the provinces, one Indian member each was allowed. And one council was in London, that was India Council, that is the State Secretary of State. And in this council, 2 Indian members were allowed, but not by this act, before this. So these are the points what you should keep in your mind related to Indian Councils Act 1909. Now let's consider the next point. So next point is related to the year 1911. In 1911, 2 points are there. One, annulment of partition of Bengal. Bengal was partitioned in 1905. But partition was annulled. That was in 1911. And second, transfer of capital. That was from Calcutta to Delhi. Next is 1915. In 1915 also, 2 events. One, foundation of Hindu Mahasabha. And Hindu Mahasabha also claimed to represent the interest of the Hindus. Muslim League was already founded that claimed to represent Muslim interest. Hindu Mahasabha, another political party, claimed to represent Hindu interest. And second is Gandhi's return to India. Mahatma Gandhi was a barrister. He left for South Africa. There he got involved in the Satyagraha movement, became successful also. From there, he went to England, and from England, he came back to India in 1915. And coming back of Mahatma Gandhi is a very important event because 1919-20 onwards, there began a new phase of Indian national movement under the leadership of Mahatma Gandhi. Next is 1916, and in 1916, 3 important events. One, Lucknow Pact. That was a pact at Lucknow between Indian National Congress and Muslim League. So this was a political unity between Muslim League and Indian National Congress. This pact was for a joint struggle for self-government. So this pact was, in a sense, a progressive move representing a united front of League and Congress for the struggle for self-government or Swaraj. Next one is Congress unity. In Surat split, 1907, the extremist or the militant nationalist had left Congress. They came back in 1960 and the Congress unity was restored. Third one is Home Rule movement. This movement was outside the Congress platform. Bal Gangadhar Tilak and Annie Besant had founded a Home Rule League, means 1H, one Home Rule League founded by Tilak and one Home Rule League founded by Annie Besant. These Home Rule Leagues were the platforms of a movement known as Home Rule movement. Home Rule refers to rule by people, or self-rule, or self-government, or you can say Swaraj in broader sense. The purpose of this movement was to bring about an awakening towards the idea of home rule and pressurize government for the introduction of home rule. Both the home rule leagues worked in cooperation with each other. And this movement played a role, an important role, in bringing about a nationalistic activism during this time. Next is 1917. In 1917, 2 events. Number 1, Champaran Satyagraha. This was the first Satyagraha of Mahatma Gandhi in India. This was Satyagraha for peasants involved in indigo plantation. They worked under a system known as Tin Kathia system because they were forced to cultivate indigo on 3/20th of their land by the planters. These peasants were highly oppressed and suppressed. And Champaran is a place in Bihar. And Mahatma Gandhi launched a satyagraha here, and this was a successful satyagraha. Next is Montagu's declaration. Montagu was the Secretary of State. This declaration is related to granting of self-government to India. The Indians supported the British in the First World War. And in return, the British began to think over the idea of granting self-government to Indians. And next is the year 1918. And in 1918, there are 4 points representing 4 events. Number 1, Ahmedabad Satyagraha. This was the second Satyagraha of Mahatma Gandhi at Ahmedabad, and this was for textile mill worker. And here Mahatma Gandhi organized his first hunger strike in India. And this Satyagraha was also a successful Satyagraha. Next one is Kheda Satyagraha. This was the third Satyagraha of Mahatma Gandhi in India. This was at a place Kheda in Gujarat, and this was for the peasants. And this too was successful. So first 3 Satyagraha of Gandhiji, of Mahatma Gandhi, Champaran, Ahmedabad and Kheda, were for the low-rung people, the peasants and the workers. They played a role in creation of the mass following of Mahatma Gandhi as a national leader subsequently. Third is Montagu-Chelmsford Report. This is also known as Montfort Report. Montfort. So Mont from here and Ford from Chelmsford. Montagu was Secretary of State. Chelmsford was the Viceroy of the Governor General. So Montagu-Chelmsford Report was a report that contained the provisions related to the Future Act, that was Government of India Act 1990. And this report contained a very, very important aspect of the constitutional reform, and that was introduction of self-government for Indians. And this followed Montagu's declaration that was made in 1917. And fourth is a split in the Congress. There took place the second split in the Congress. First split was in 1907. And in this split, the extremists left Congress, but unity was restored in 1916, I have discussed. Second split took place on the issue of Montagu-Chelmsford Report. A group in the Congress, that group represented moderates, the moderates leader, supported this report, whereas the other were against this. Result was a conflict, and the moderates left Congress. These moderates came to be known as liberals. Their leaders were, 2 main leaders were Surendranath Banerjee and Tej Bahadur Sapru. They founded a separate organization, All India Liberal Federation, whose founder president was Surendranath Banerjee. Later, Tej Bahadur Sapru also became president, but not in the year 1918-19. So toward the end of 1918 and early 1919, we find a split in the Congress, and because of this split, there emerged a new organization of liberals, and two main leaders were S.N. Banerjee and Tej Bahadur Sapru. And after that, the last year and the related events is 1919. So in 1919, the first event is Rowlatt Act Satyagraha. Rowlatt Act was passed in 19. The name is after the name of the person who drafted this bill, Mr. Rowlatt. This act was an assault on the civil liberties of Indian people. This was considered a black act by Indian leaders. Mahatma Gandhi opposed this and started countrywide satyagraha known as Rowlatt Act Satyagraha. This was Mahatma Gandhi's first All India Satyagraha and fourth in row. So Gandhi's first Satyagraha was Champara, then Ahmedabad, then Kheda. These three were local Satyagraha. And the fourth Satyagraha was Rowlatt Act Satyagraha, that was All India Satyagraha. Mahatma Gandhi launched India-wide demonstrations and protest. And in Punjab, this led to one very tragic event, that is number 2, Jallianwala Bagh Massacre. Britishers killed a huge number of innocent people. And after this, Rowlatt Act Satyagraha was withdrawn. Next is Government of India Act 1919 was passed. Background of the Government of India Act 1919 is Montagu-Chelmsford Report 1918 and Montagu's Declaration 1917. Or in reverse, first Montagu's Declaration 1917, then Montagu-Chelmsford Report 1918, and then Government of India Act 1919. And the features of Government of India Act 1919 are also important for you. Let's consider them first. So first feature, number 1, is division of subjects. And one more thing, the name of the act is Government of India Act. Before this, the acts were known as Indian Consuls Act. So division of subjects, central and provincial. Before this, there was no division. This act divided the subjects, central and provincial. This means certain subjects placed under the power of the central government and some other placed under the power of the provincial government. Number 2, diarchy in provinces. Diarchy refers to dual government. And this was in fact the self-government given to Indians. And what was diarchy in fact? You can consider in the light of point 1. So division of subject, central and provincial. And provincial subjects were further divided under transferred subject, TS, and under reserved subject, RS. Transferred subject placed under the governor of the province plus Indian ministers, and reserved subject placed under the jurisdiction of the governor plus his executive council. So there began a government on 2 lines in the provinces. One line, transfer subject under governor and Indian ministers, and second line, reserve subject under governor and his executive council. So this represent a dual government, that means a diarchy. Now Indian ministers here give you the idea what kind of self-government was given. This means the provincial subjects were bifurcated into two. One was transferred, one was reserved. And under transferred subject, Indian ministers were involved. This means the Indian parties would be fighting election, enter legislature, and the party or parties in majority would form the ministry. And these ministers will be the part of the provincial government with governor, and their jurisdiction were to be transferred subject only. And division was such that all the important subjects were placed under reserve, like finance, law and order, police, and the subjects of lesser importance placed under transfer. Besides, governor was there. Indian ministers were not alone to govern. So you can say a very little self-government was given because there was no self-government at central level and there was no complete self-government at provincial level. So this was the response of the British government to the nationalist demand of Swaraj or self-government or self-rule or home rule. Point number third is bicameral central legislature. Central legislature was unicameral before this. This act provided for two houses in the central legislature. One house, Council of Estates, this was upper house, and the second house, Central Legislative Assembly, this was the lower house. Next is extension of separate electorates to 6. The Act of 1909 had introduced separate electorates for Muslims. 5. Expansion of powers of central legislature. And 6. Expansion of provincial legislatures and their powers. This means the strength of both central and provincial legislatures were increased and their powers were also increased. Next is salary of Secretary of State from British Exchequer. Before this, the salary of Secretary of State was given from Indian Exchequer, means this was out of Indian revenue. And last, Office of High Commissioner for India. He was an agent of Governor General in Council in London. And Governor General in Council means Governor General of Viceroy plus his council. So he represented, the High Commissioner represented the Viceroy or Governor General of India and his council in London. So these are all the important provisions of the Government of India Act 1919. And under this, the provision number 1 and provision number 2 and provision number 3 and provision number 4 are very, very important. So we should focus on them. Now let's consider the next point. And the next point and the last point associated with the year 1919 is Khilafat issue. Khilafat issue refers to the issue related to the Caliph of Turkey. Turkey was defeated in the First World War, and the Allied powers, and Britain was a part of this, imposed a humiliating treaty that endangered Caliph, who was politico-religious head of Muslims all over the world. So there emerged a pro-Caliph sentiments, giving rise to a movement to protect Caliph or Khalifa and Khilafat. Khilafat refers to succession, and Khalifa refers to the politico-religious head of the Muslims. Originally, the successors of the Prophet. So, Khilafat issue emerged during this time. This emerged as a major issue in India as well. Indian Muslims also began to show sentiments for the protection of Khalifa or Caliph. Mahatma Gandhi supported this issue, and Khilafat committee was formed, and Mahatma Gandhi was appointed president. And from this platform, Mahatma Gandhi launched a movement known as Khilafat movement. I will be discussing this in the second part of Indian National Movement. So this is the last point related to the year 1919. So in this presentation, I have discussed all the events during the phase 1906-7 to 1919. And this lecture is a lecture on Indian National Movement from 1885 to 1990. In the next lecture, I will be starting from 1919-1920. Good study. Hello everyone. This is the second lecture on Indian National Movement. In the first lecture, I have covered the period 1885 to 1919. And in this lecture, I am going to throw light on the period 1920 to 1935. One significant piece of information for you, and that is 1919-20 marked the beginning of the third phase, and of course a new phase of Indian National Movement. The first phase being the phase of the moderates, the second being the phase of the extremists. And the third phase is the phase of Mahatma Gandhi, popularly known as the Gandhian phase. So this information is also important for you. You should have this broad idea that Indian National Movement 1885 to 1947 is divided into three broad phases, and the year 1919-20 marked the beginning of a new phase. Now let's consider the important aspects of Indian National Movement of the period 1920-1935. As you have come to know that 1919-20 marked the beginning of the Gandhian phase. So first important aspect for you is Gandhian ideology and program. So under Gandhian ideology and program, the first aspect is the novel ideas. And the first novel idea is Satyagraha. And Satyagraha refers to a struggle for truth, opposition to wrong, and through non-violent means. So non-violence is another important idea, that is point B. Third is means and end. According to this, means are equally important as end. End refers to goal. So according to Gandhi, means must be right means. Means must be non-violent means. Means must be noble means and legitimate means. So attainment of Swaraj or freedom by any means was not acceptable to him. Next is trusteeship. The trusteeship theory of Gandhi represented his approach to social harmony. He was a believer in social change, but by means of promoting social harmony, not by class struggle or class conflict as we find in the socialist ideas. And A, B, C, D, what I have mentioned here, could be an options in the question related to Gandhian ideas. So these four represent the four major ideas of Gandhi. Next aspect related to Gandhian ideology and program is novel methods. Mahatma Gandhi employed various novel methods. These novel methods became characteristic features of the Gandhian phase of Indian national movement. And the first one here is non-cooperation. That means not to cooperate with the government. And it represents a kind of political strategy to pressurize the government. Second is civil disobedience. That means to disobey the law in peaceful manner and to be ready to accept punishment. Next one is marches. A very famous march of Gandhi was Dandi March that led to beginning of civil disobedience movement. Next is hunger strike. The first hunger strike of Gandhi was in Ahmedabad Satyagraha in 1918. Next is mass mobilization. Gandhi was a believer in the strength of the masses. So his idea was that national movement must be a multi-class movement. So he worked for mobilization of various classes of Indian society, peasants, labor, women, etc. Next one, a struggle, truce struggle. A typical strategy, what we find during Gandhian mass movement. And a struggle, truce struggle refers to Indian national movement representing two forms. One, that is a struggle. Two, that is truce. A struggle refers to extra-constitutional, extra-legal, vigorous mass movement like non-cooperation, civil disobedience, Quit India movement. And truce refers to withdrawal from a struggle. This means withdrawal from extra-constitutional, extra-legal, vigorous mass movement and get connected to the other means, and these other means were organization of meetings, sabhas, mobilization of people, constructive program. Next one is constructive program. Constructive program of Gandhi was a comprehensive socio-economic program. And this had several components like charkha, that is the spinning. Next, cottage industries, Hindu-Muslim unity, upliftment of Harijan, upliftment of women, sanitation and cleanliness and hygiene. So he made constructive program an important dimension, important aspect of the Indian national movement. So this is all about the novel methods. And the constructive program of Gandhiji represent the socio-economic, cultural dimension of Indian national movement under Gandhian leadership. So these two aspects related to Gandhian ideas and program are important because you may have a specific question and these options could be there. You have to identify that which of following was novel methods or the novel ideas introduced by Gandhiji. Now I'm moving on to the next one. And the next presentation here is on the events of the year 1990. I have already discussed this, but this is just to remind you. The year 1919 witnessed these four events: Rowlatt Act and Rowlatt Act Satyagrah, Jallianwala Bagh Massacre, passing of Government of India Act 1919, and rise of Khilafat issue. And all these four caused widespread discontent among the people and the leaders. And they created ground for the rise of mass movement. This mass movement began in 1920 in the form of Khilafat movement and non-cooperation movement. So these four together can be considered as the major causes of the Khilafat non-cooperation movement in 1920. Now let's consider the Khilafat issue and the movement, and then non-cooperation movement. So first, the Khilafat agitation. The Khilafat agitation was based on the Khilafat issue. That was the issue to save Khilafat. That means to save succession. That is succession from the Prophet. And related to Khilafat agitation, a few points are important for you. One, formation of Central Khilafat Committee, March 1990. Second, Gandhi elected as president, November 1990. Third, acceptance of program of non-cooperation in June 1920. And fourth, launch of non-cooperation movement from this platform, Central Khilafat Committee, 1st August 1920. Years are just for giving you a broad idea. What is important is that you should know that rise of Khilafat issue in 1919. And what was this issue? This was the issue to save Khalifa of Turkey or Khilafat, that means succession. So Khalifa refers to successor and Khilafat refers to successor. As a result of defeat of Turkey in the First World War and imposition of a humiliating treaty on Turkey by the Allied powers. And the second thing is that there emerge sentiments on the part of the Muslims, many parts of the world, including India. These sentiments were pro-Khalifa or Caliph or pro-Khilafat. These sentiments found expression in protest and movement, and that took place in India also. So the sequence is this. This means in this sequence, the Khilafat movement emerged. And then you have come to know that Gandhi was elected as the president. This means Gandhi supported the Khilafat issue. And the non-cooperation movement launched on 1st August 1920 on this platform is known as Khilafat movement. And Now I'm moving on to the non-cooperation movement. And then I will distinguish that what the difference between the non-cooperation movement from this platform and the non-cooperation movement I am going to talk about. The non-cooperation movement. And this movement was from the Congress platform. This means there emerged two movements. How two movements? Central Khilafat Committee under the leadership of Gandhiji launched non-cooperation on the issue of Khilafat, and this movement is known as Khilafat movement. But essentially this was non-cooperation movement nature-wise, because the idea was not to cooperate with the government. And Indian National Congress too launched a non-cooperation movement in the same year. After that, means after the launch of non-cooperation from the platform of Khilafat Committee, and that too under the leadership of Gandhi. So this movement is in general known as non-cooperation movement. And the non-cooperation launched from the Khilafat Committee platform is in general known as Khilafat movement. So we normally call Khilafat non-cooperation movement because this was a twin movement. They were connected. Leadership was the same, Gandhi. And there was Hindu-Muslim unity. Gandhiji had forced a joint front between Hindu and Muslim against the British. He used the Khilafat issue to create this unity. He considered the Khilafat issue as a legitimate issue. His idea was that when the Muslims were in crisis, they needed support. And the Britishers were wrong. So this was a legitimate issue for a legitimate movement. And the non-cooperation movement, what I'm going to discuss, launched from the Congress platform, had three aims. One was Khilafat issue. Second was Swaraj. Third was Punjab wrong. Punjab wrong was related to Jallianwala Bagh massacre. So point here is that the non-cooperation launched from the Khilafat Committee platform stood for Khilafat issue. Whereas non-cooperation, what I'm going to discuss, launched from Congress platform, stood for three issues. Khilafat issue, the issue of Swaraj, and the issue of Punjab wrong. This means this movement was marked by triple goal. Second point here is non-cooperation. Non-cooperation was a basic feature of this movement. And non-cooperation refers to not to cooperate with the government in order to pressurize the government, in order to protest, in order to resist. Next is extended boycott. Extended boycott refers to boycott of British goods, at the same time boycott of British institutions. If there is a boycott of goods only, so we call it boycott. We use the term extended boycott when the boycott of goods extended to boycott of the British institutions also, like British schools, colleges, courts, legislature, etc. Fourth, new leadership, and that was the leadership of Mahatma Gandhi. Next is new ideological parameters. And new ideological parameters were the Gandhian ideas: satyagraha, non-violence, means and end, Next is constructive program. Constructive program was a very important part of this movement, what I have discussed. Next is wider geographical spread. Non-cooperation movement was the second mass movement, the first being Swadeshi. And its spread was wider than the spread of the Swadeshi movement. Next is rural social base. This movement played a role in building the rural social base of Indian national movement. And so geographical spread was towards rural areas as well. It was just not confined to urban areas. Next is labor strikes. Several labor strikes took place during this movement. So these labor strikes were an expression of resistance, in fact, being the part of non-cooperation movement. Next one, women's participation. Women's participation in active way, first we find in Swadeshi. And in this movement we find a still wider participation of women. Next, non-cooperation spirit in peasant, labor and Akali movement. Non-cooperation spirit inspired and influenced the peasant organization and movement that got a fillip during this time in many parts. And the labor movement, as we find in the labor strikes, and Akali movement, that was a movement of the Sikhs to free Gurudwaras from the corrupt Mahants. So these 11 points represent the major features of the non-cooperation movement. And in the light of these, you also understand the significance of the non-cooperation movement. Now let's consider the next one. Next aspect is the Swarajist. Khilafat non-cooperation movement came to an end by 1922-23. Khilafat movement ended because the office of Khalifa or Caliph was abolished in Turkey by Mustafa Kemal Pasha, leader of a new nationalist movement there. So the issue of Khilafat lost relevance. Result of this was the Khilafat movement also lost relevance. And non-cooperation movement was suspended by Gandhi in 1922 as a result of a violent event at Chauri Chaur. And so by 1920-23, we find that Khilafat and non-cooperation spirit subsided completely. And after this, what was there on the platform Indian National Congress? Gandhian constructive program was there. But there were some Congress leaders who wanted to pursue a new political strategy known as council entry. They are known as Swarajist. In fact, in 1922, a group of Congress leaders, two important beings, Motilal Nehru and Chittaranjan Das, presented the proposal that Congress should fight election now, since there was no movement, and enter legislature and present nationalistic demands there and create pressure on the government. Idea was to use legislature as a platform for nationalistic struggle. This program is known as council entry. Council means legislature. But there was a big group in Congress, they were opposed to this. So those who supported this idea came to be known as pro-changes. And those opposed to this came to be known as no changes. And these no changes were mainly the followers of Gandhi. So result of this was that the pro-changes set up a party within Indian National Congress. The name of the party was Congress Swarajist Party. Name of the party was Council Entry. And they got involved in election processes, fought election, entered legislature, and began to present nationalistic demands there and created nationalistic press. So this politics is known as Swarajist constitutional politics that began in 1922 and ended in 1927. Later, Gandhiji also allowed the Congress leaders to participate in election. Swarajist constitutional politics played a role during this period, 1922-1927, in filling in a political void created by the sudden suspension of non-cooperation movement in 1922. Swarajist politics came to an end in 1927 because of announcement of Simon Commission and beginning of anti-Simon movement. Now let's move on to the next aspect. Now the next aspect is the socialist ideology and program. This is the period, this period 1922-27, when we find the rise of several new young leaders like Jawaharlal Nehru, Subhash Chandra Bose. And 1927 onwards, these new leaders began to propagate the socialist ideas. So there emerged a new group of leaders in Congress platform like Jawaharlal Nehru, Subhash Chandra Bose, who were socialist, who were believers in socialist ideas. They were influenced by Russian Revolution and the Russian experiments. They began to propagate this idea on Congress platform. And suspension of non-cooperation and a kind of political void also created a favorable condition for a drift towards socialism. So 1927 onwards, we find a rise of socialists within the Congress. And here, there are important aspects related to the socialist. And these aspects are related to their ideology and program. So first here is leftist vision. The socialists were leftist. So they represented leftist vision. Second, freedom defined in socio-economic terms. They consider that political freedom is not adequate. Freedom must be in socio-economic terms as well. This means there must be socio-economic equality, socio-economic progress, and end of socio-economic exploitation. Next is Purna Swaraj. That means complete independence. The goal of non-cooperation movement under Gandhi was Swaraj. That means self-rule or self-government. Government by people of India, but under British sovereignty. Purna Swaraj refers to complete independence. Self-rule plus sovereignty as well. So socialists were the first who raised this idea. Gandhiji was not in favor of Purna Swaraj at this time. But finally, he too accepted this And the result was that in 1929, the Lahore session of Congress, where the president was Jawaharlal Nehru, Pune Swaraj Declaration was made. And that means now Congress adopted a new goal, that was Pune Swaraj. This was a shift from the old goal, that was Swaraj. Now, let's recall the goal of the Congress from the very beginning. So 1885 to 1905, the goal of Congress was reforms under moderates. 1906, a new goal, Swaraj. And 1929, again a new goal, that was Pune Swaraj. Next one is radical stand on economic issues. Next one, new approach to economic progress and economic development. And this approach was characterized by planning. This was characterized by industrialization. This was characterized by important role of the state. And this was based on the models what emerged in Russia, USSR after Russian Revolution 1970. Next one, radical stand on class issues like labor issues, peasant issues. Next, focus on mobilization of workers and peasants. Though this mobilization was there, but now we find a renewed focus. Next one, focus on mobilization of the youth and students. This also represents a renewed focus, though this was there earlier also. And next, concern for the people of princely estates. In princely estates, the princely rulers were autocrats. So there was a widespread dissatisfaction among the people of the princely estates. And they had started their own movement known as Praja Mandal movement for democratic rule. But Gandhiji adopted a policy in 1920 that Congress as an organization would not participate in Praja Mandal movement because conditions differed in the princely estates from those of the British India. But socialists stood for the support to the Praja Mandal movement. They showed much concern for the people of the native estates. And their idea was that the Pune Swaraj idea was applicable to the people of native estates as well. So in the light of 1 to 9, what I've explained, you have come to know that the socialists representing the leftists within Congress presented a new vision, new approach, new strategies, new program. And they influenced Indian national movement considerably. And now I am going to throw light on one aspect related to the socialist, that is new direction to Congress program. As I have said, the socialists gave a new direction to Indian national movement or Congress movement. And this new direction or new orientation can be considered in the light of their ideology and program, what I have discussed. Now I am going to give you some important information as regards certain milestones with respect to certain specific Congress sessions. And these are the milestones of some important moves by the socialists. So first is Lahore session, 1929. And this was presided over by a socialist president, Jawaharlal Nehru. And this is known for Pune Swaraj Declaration. And this was made on 31st December 1929, midnight. And the very next year, 1930, on 26th January, first Independence Day was celebrated, though India was not free. And this became a motivating point, a motivating force for the next mass movement, that is civil disobedience movement in 1930. Next one is Karachi session 1931. This session is known for passing of a 20-point resolution on fundamental rights and economic program. Take a look. Karachi session 1931. This passed a 20-point resolution, and this resolution was on basic civil rights like freedom of speech, freedom of press, etc. for the first time on Congress platform. Second, agrarian issues. It presented several issues related to peasants, like reduction of land revenue, end of their exploitation by zamindars. Third, it presented labor issues, certain specific issues related to labor, like reasonable condition of work, reasonable wages, right to form trade union, etc. And last, issues related to minority and linguistic areas. And this was related to protection of the minorities and linguistic areas, socio-cultural tradition. So for the first time, we find on the Congress platform, such resolution was passed containing all these, and they were expression of the socialist idealism. And this resolution was drafted by Jawaharlal Nehru. Now let's consider next one. Next one is number 3, Congress Socialist Party, set up in 1934. This was a party within Indian National Congress. So this was also a unique case, because formation of the party meant now the socialists had a separate membership, separate constitution as well, and a separate vision, as I have discussed. But they were also the part of the Congress. So they had a twofold, you can say, goals. One was the goal under Indian National Congress, and second, the goal under Socialist Party. Nehru did not become the member of this, considering that the membership of Congress was enough. Next one is Fajpur session 1936. This was presided over by Jawaharlal Nehru. And in this session, a comprehensive agrarian program was presented. Next is Haripura session 1938. This was presided over by another famous socialist leader, Subhash Chandra Bose. And in 1938, Indian planning body was created within Indian National Congress. Aim of this body was to formulate plan for India's development. And socialists believed in planning as an important instrument for economic change. So these are some important points that suggest new direction to Congress program given by the socialist. And I should name some important socialist leaders of this time also. One was, of course, Jawaharlal Nehru, and one was Subhash Chandra Bose. But Jawaharlal Nehru had not become the member of Congress Socialist Party. The others were Jayaprakash Narayan, Ram Manohar Lohia, Acharya Narendra Dev, Ashok Mehta, etc. Now let's move on to next aspect. And next aspect is Indian national movement 1927 to 1935. Till now you have come to know that 1919, 1920 marked the beginning of a new phase, that is the Gandhian phase. 1920, Khilafat non-cooperation movement were launched. But non-cooperation movement was suspended in 1922 and Khilafat movement too lost relevance. Then 1922 onwards till 1927, Swarajist played a role. This period is known as the age of the Swarajist. And 1927 onwards, you have come to know, there emerged a new leadership that was a leftist leadership, and this was socialist. Now 1927, what all happened is important. And 1927 to 1935 represent a very, very important period of Indian national movement. You have come to know that in 1927, Swarajist politics came to an end because of announcement of Simon Commission and beginning of anti-Simon agitation. So, the trends of this period of Indian national movement begins with the event announcement of Simon Commission and beginning of anti-Simon agitation. Here in this presentation, you have two aspects. One aspect is the British, one aspect is Indian National Congress. Both are presented separately with their respective years. So first here you find is 1927. Simon Commission was announced. This is under British. And then you find anti-Simon agitation that was under INC. Similarly, all the points are there. So let's consider this one by one. So in 1927, the British announced the appointment of Simon Commission, a commission headed by John Simon. And the objective of this commission was to review the working of the Government of India Act 1919 and to present recommendation for future constitutional reforms in India. But this commission had no Indian member. This caused great dissatisfaction among the nationalist leadership. They protested against this and they launched a movement, what is known as anti-Simon agitation in 1927. The idea of the nationalist leadership was that the constitutional reform in India would be better appreciated by Indians, not the British. So there must be Indian members in the commission, but there was none. Then point number 2 is related to the year 1928. Simon Commission reached India. So this is British side. And INC side, Nehru Report. Nehru Report was a draft constitution prepared by a committee, and this committee was headed by Motilal Nehru, so known as Nehru Committee, and so the report is known as Nehru Report. This committee was an all-party committee. And what does it mean, all-party committee here? This means that though I have mentioned here INC, the INC here represents nationalist. All major parties participated in anti-Simon agitation. The most important being Indian National Congress. So all-party committee means the committee where we find members from all the major parties. So they join hand to oppose Simon Commission and they joined hand to draft a constitution for India. That is Nehru Report. The goal in Nehru Report was dominion status. That was self-rule or self-government under British sovereignty. The kind of a status the British had given to white settlers colonies of Canada, New Zealand, Australia, South Africa. And point number next is related to year 1929. Simon Commission at work. Simon Commission raised India in 28, started working. And this side you find Purna Swaraj Declaration. And how the idea of Purna Swaraj emerged, I have discussed already. Now the important point here is that the Britishers appointed Simon Commission, sent Simon Commission to India. Simon Commission started working under its terms of reference. On the other hand, the nationalist, whose premier organization was Indian National Congress, got involved in anti-Simon agitation, prepared a draft constitution that was a response to the Simon Commission working and the report of Simon Commission, what Simon Commission presented later in 1930. And in 1929, Congress in Lahore session declared Purna Swaraj as a goal. In Nehru Report, the goal was dominion status. Not Purna Swaraj. Purna Swaraj's goal was emphasized by the new socialist leadership. And under their pressure, finally, this goal was accepted. Next is 1930, RTC 1, that is Round Table Conference 1. In 1930, Simon Commission presented its report. And in order to discuss this report, the British convened a Round Table Conference in London and invited all the political parties of India. And on the other hand, here we find Gandhi presented his 11-point demands. These 11-point demands were nationalistic demands. And Gandhi presented view that if these demands were accepted by the British, the Congress would not launch civil disobedience movement for Purna Swaraj. So Purna Swaraj declaration was just not declaration. It was decided that in order to attain Purna Swaraj, civil disobedience movement would be launched under Gandhian leadership. So 11-point demand of Gandhi in 1930 represent a kind of compromising approach. But these 11 points were not accepted. Result of this was Gandhi staged Dandi March from Sabarmati to Dandi and made salt and broke salt law, and with this began Civil Disobedience Movement, CDM. This all took place in 1930. I hope now you are getting year-wise development in both the sides, British side and the Congress side. In 1931, RTC 2, second round table conference was to be convened. And British wanted that Congress should participate because Congress had not participated in first round table conference because Congress was opposing, and Congress had launched a movement that was civil disobedience movement. So there took place a pact, what is known as Gandhi-Irving Pact. between Gandhi and Viceroy Irwin. Under this pact, Gandhi accepted the suspension of civil disobedience movement and to participate in second round table conference to be held in 1931 towards the end. So Gandhi suspended CDM and participated in round table conference 2 as a representative of Indian National Congress, but came back frustrated and empty-handed. He realized that this was all unproductive participation in such conferences. British had no bona fide intention to give anything worthwhile under constitutional reforms. And they were hell-bent upon dividing Indians because in these conferences, Britishers were supporting the divisive forces, like demand for the separate electorates, for example. Next point is related to the year 1932. In 1932, British side you find communal award. Under communal award, the British granted separate electorates for untouchables. This was the demand of Dr. Ambedkar. This demand he had presented before Simon Commission in 1928 in India. And then he attended the first round table conference. He attended the second, he attended third also, and there also he presented the same demand. And the British welcomed and supported and appreciated such demands because fulfillment of such demands meant division within Indian society. Gandhiji resisted, opposed, and observed fast unto death. Result of this was there took place a talk between Gandhiji and Dr. Ambedkar at Pune, and this talk resulted into a pact that is known as Pune Pact. This is what you find here, Pune Pact, same year, 1932. So under Pune Pact, Dr. Ambedkar withdrew the demand of separate electorates in return for reservations of the untouchables at various levels. After Gandhiji came back empty-handed, considered Round Table Conference 2 as unproductive, and resumed civil disobedience movement. So CDM resumed in the beginning of 1932. That is January 1932. He came back in December 1931. And in 1932, third round table conference also convened, in which Congress did not participate. Now Congress was again involved in civil disobedience movement. CDM resumed now is known as the second phase of CDM. And the second phase, the British began to suppress CDM. And it had been going on for a long time. So it began to show some declining trends. And eventually, the CDM was ended in 1934. So 1933, CDM continued, but it was finally ended in 1934. And now consider British side, in 1933, a white paper was issued. White paper was on constitutional reforms of India as deliberated by Simon Commission and in round table conferences. And a joint committee was formed, a committee of the members from both the houses of British Parliament. The terms of reference was to present report on the constitutional reforms in the light of the deliberations in the round table conferences and the light of the Simon Commission report. And the joint committee presented report in 1934. And this report became the basis for the Government of India Act 1935. So appointment of Simon Commission in 1927 finally led to the enactment of Government of India Act 1935. And this is British side. Now, if you consider INC side or nationalist side, so that begins with the anti-Simon agitation, then to Nehru Report, then to Pune Swaraj Declaration, then Dandi March, beginning of CDM, Gandhi-Irwin Pact, suspension of CDM, again resumption of CDM, and end of CDM. So Pune Swaraj goal could not be achieved. And last point here is INC shows dissatisfaction towards this act. INC was not happy with this act. Jawaharlal Nehru said that this act is like a machine, and this machine has all brakes, no engine. So everything here is to a stop, to check. Nothing here is for further progress. So the period 1927 to 1935 is a very, very important period of Indian national movement, and in this period you find so many events took place. Appointment of Simon Commission, roundtable conferences, Communal Award, Pune Pact, Dandi March, Pune Swaraj Declaration, etc., etc. And all are important for your preliminary examination. And I have presented this in chronological sequence. Starting from 1927, both the sides, and ending 1935, both the sides. Now, here, two aspects are separately important for you. One aspect is civil disobedience movement, 1930-34. This was the third mass movement and the second under Gandhian leadership. First mass movement being Swadeshi movement under moderates, extremists, then revolutionaries. Second mass movement was under Gandhian leadership, non-cooperation. And third was this. So there are certain facets related to CDM important for preliminary examination. So I am going to discuss that. Second important aspect here is the Government of India Act 1935. All the major provisions of Government of India Act 1935 are important for your preliminary exam. So I will discuss that also. So let's discuss first civil disobedience movement. First point here is, and the chronology is very clear, 1930 to 1934. Background is very clear. And background is Pune Swaraj Declaration, 1929 and onwards. So first point here is goal. Goal was Pune Swaraj. Second is, this was based on the idea of civil disobedience. And civil disobedience means disobedience of law in peaceful manner. Disobedience of salt law. Was the central issue. In the areas where violation of salt law was not possible, so violation of other laws like forest laws. So in many parts of India, like central India, forest laws were violated. Third is pan-British India. So this movement is spread to almost all parts of British India. Next, salt marches. First salt march was Dandi March by Gandhiji. And several such salt marches took place, like salt marches in Kerala. salt marches in Madras, salt marches in Odisha. And several Congress leaders played a role, like K. Kelappan in Kerala, C. Rajagopalachari in Madras, etc. Next is new forms of mobilization. And these new forms were Patrika, that is magazines, Prabhat Feri, that is making round in the morning, Vanar Sena, that is the band of boys, and next Manjari Sena, that was a band of girls. So these bands also played a role in conveying messages during CDM. Next is active role of women, students, labor and peasants. These classes played role in non-cooperation movement also, but their role was magnified now. Next point. Major trends during civil disobedience movement. And all these facts are important for you. First is Red Shirt movement in Northwest Frontier region by Khan Abdul Ghaffar Khan, also known as Badshah Khan, popularly known as Frontier Gandhi. This movement was also known as Khudai Khidmatgar movement. Next, Sholapur Textile Workers Strike, a massive strike that took place in Sholapur. Next, Dharsana Satyagraha, and here a very important role played by Sarojini Naidu. Next, non-revenue campaign in UP and Gujarat region. Next, Chatgaon uprising. This was under the leadership of the revolutionary Surya Sen. Next, no Chaukidari tax campaign in Bengal and Bihar. So this was agitation against Chaukidari tax. Next, students' agitation against Cunningham Circular in Assam. Cunningham Circular was meant for putting a check on a student's participation. Next, forest laws defense in Maharashtra and Karnataka. And next, revolt of Rani Gedinlui in northeast in Manipur region and adjoining Naga belts. This shows that the movement is spread to all parts of India, like Red Shirt movement in the northwest, revolt of Rani Gedinlui, northeast, salt marches, what I've discussed in Madras region, Kerala region. So these all trends representing several events. Important question may be like this here also, that which of the following event took place during CDM, like Dharsana Satyagraha in Gujarat, like Sholapur Textile Workers Strike in Maharashtra, this way. Now I'm going to throw light on the major provisions of the Government of India Act 1935. So first here is the provision for All India Federation to be constituted by British India and the princely estates. But this provision did not come into existence. Federation did not come into existence. And why? The reason being that there were conditions of a minimum participation on the part of the princely rulers. Since this condition was not fulfilled, so federation did not come into being. Next is federal, provincial and concurrent list. This provided for 3 lists. The Act of 1919 provided for 2 lists, central and provincial. This provided for 3 lists, federal, subject under federal government or central government, provincial, subject under provincial government, and concurrent, subject under both the government. And 3, residuary powers were vested in Governor General. These are some salient features of a federal system. These features characterize today's Indian federal system as well. But today's case is that the residuary powers are vested in the center. As per this act, residuary powers were vested in Governor General. Next is bicameral legislature at center. This was created by the Act of 1919 and this was retained. Council of Estates, the upper house, and Federal Assembly, the lower house. So name of the lower house was changed. Next, bicameral legislature in 6 provinces. Till now, the legislature in provinces were unicameral. This act introduced bicameralism in 6 provinces: Bihar, Bombay, Madras, Bengal, UP, and Assam. 6, diarchy at center. The Act of 1919 had introduced diarchy at provincial level. Diarchy at provincial level was abolished and this was introduced at central level and the system was the same what I have discussed. 7, provincial autonomy. So the system of diarchy at provincial level was replaced by provincial autonomy, under which the provinces were given greater autonomy to in governance, you can say. The essence was that the Indian ministers were given greater autonomy in the governance of autonomy. Still, there were several checks on the part of the governor of the province and the Governor General of India. Next is federal court. There was a provision for federal court and this was constituted also. And this court was meant for interpretation of the federal provincial concurrent list and adjudication of the issues of conflict between the center provinces, and also the native states. Next is abolition of India Council. India Council was a 15-member council in London and the function was to assist the Secretary of State. This was abolished. And next is separation of Burma. The whole Burma was made the part of British India, you have come to know earlier. First Lower Burma by Dalhousie and then Upper Burma by Duffy. By this act, the Burma was separated from the administrative jurisdiction of British India. So these are the important provisions of Government of India Act 1935. In this lecture, I have covered development of Indian national movement from 1919 to 1920. 1919, 1920 to 1935. This means I have covered a big part of the last phase, that is the Gandhian phase. The period that is left, 1935-36 to 1947, I will be covering in the next lecture, whose title would be Run Up to India's Independence. In this lecture, there are several trends beginning 1919, 1920 till 1935. So many important events took place. Like in this period you find a very important act was passed. In this period you find the third mass movement took place. In this period you find Congress adopted a new goal, etc., etc. And one thing important for you, that when you work on this, you work in chronological order. This simply means you work in such a way that your chronological sequence is not disturbed, because in the overall preparation, this broad idea of the chronological sequence is important, though you're not supposed to mug up years. Good study.